So history is weird, right? A series of infinite decisions and infinite ways for the almighty Xenu to completely wipe out all life on this tiny speck of livable space in an ever-expanding universe. Surviving extinction-level events, plague, war, famine, all to produce you, sitting at work or school or wherever, watching a YouTube video. What a time to be alive! But seriously, think about all the critical moments in history and how sometimes insignificant events shaped literally everything that came after it. Hannibal losing 2/3 of his army crossing the Alps. Constantinople being conquered because of an unlocked gate. A British officer in the American Revolution not checking a note saying that George Washington was crossing the Delaware River, eagle perched upon his shoulders, striding into the hearts and minds of every American. God bless the USA! But what if some of those things changed? We've all seen the TV shows or movies where the main character goes back in time, steps on a butterfly, and all of a sudden there's an orangutan as president. Wait. Or accidentally getting catapulted back through time and hooking up with your mom. What? But have you ever thought about how those world-shaping events could have ended differently? What if all those little changes added up to one big change? I don't know about you, but I'd take a mockumentary on how something turned out differently instead of a preposterous TV show about Japan. A country with very limited industrial power and even more limited manpower could have defeated a very large and very angry United States of America. Man in the high castle, my ass. I've got nothing against that type of alternate history. Hell, Cody seems like a great guy. But today, I'm going to try to take you through one of those scenarios using all the tactical thinking and 20/20 hindsight that an art school student has to offer. With the centennial remembrances of the First World War soon to come to a close and that window for mass exposure officially closing, I thought I'd take a look at just how close Germany came to pulling off an upset victory over the Entente powers. Now you may be thinking, please, I know two ways that the Germans could have won. If only I had been there with my armchair military tactics, and all of my armchair military knowledge. Shut it! I am the armchair field marshal in this bitch, and I already know what you're going to say. That they could have won during either the Schlieffen Plan or the Kaiserschlacht. That the Germans could have ended the war just after it had started, or steamrolled the Allies before America could also start throwing corpses at them. Well, strap in, hotshot, because neither of those two scenarios were ever going to work. The Schlieffen Plan at the time it was implemented was about as flexible as those suburban moms who hang around coffee shops and yoga pants all day getting wine drunk instead of actually going to yoga. It was poorly planned, outdated, and didn't account at all for Britain right across the channel, coming to Belgium's aid and f***ing everything right up. The Kaiserschlacht, or Spring Offensive if you're not an asshole like me, was even less likely to have succeeded. Yes, the Germans broke through the Allied lines and captured the most territory since the beginning of the war, but it was so barren and unimportant that they might as well have captured chlamydia. Plus, their forces were so depleted and their supplies were so short that there was no real chance for replacing troops, and the assault was destined to flounder with the Allies liberating the shit out of all of them with some newfangled death machines called tanks. No, they had a chance, a slim chance, of pulling out victory in 1917. Now, before you type furiously into the comments that I don't know anything about history and I'm not worthy of my own YouTube channel, I understand that their actual situation at the end of 1917 wasn't terrific. The US had entered the war, Austria was even more of a useless ass than before, which is saying something, and they were having serious manpower and food problems, but think about all they had accomplished by that point. Germany had held on to the parts of France they had taken, caused mass mutinies within the French army itself, kept the Austrians afloat, and kicked Russia's ass up and down the battlefield so hard that they fell chaotically into the waiting grasp of Vladimir Lenin and his band of merry men. Sure, they were not doing great, but neither was anybody else, so a German victory wasn't out of the question. Which makes you wonder, what could they have done differently? Well, the short answer to that, being shouted dramatically from a hilltop 1,000 feet high, is Don't get the US involved! Now, I don't want to make it seem like I'm giving the US all the credit for the war. Far from it. They're like the guy in a fight that lets both sides beat themselves half to death, comes in and punches one guy once, ends the fight and takes all the credit. But their industrial power and the size of the army they could eventually field was a real game changer, and the biggest mistake the German High Command made during the war was goading them into conflict. And it's not even like they had to. The German High Command thought so little of the Americans' ability to wage war, they had junior officers draw up plans for an invasion of the US that were recovered from the Imperial German War Office. What the f***? So let's take a quick look at what they actually did that eventually cost them the war. The first action that everyone correctly points to on the red, white, and blue road to U.S. entry was the sinking of the Lusitania. It happened in 1915, it's really well known, and I don't want to linger on this one. So in summary, German U-boats sank a civilian ship that had Americans on board because they said that they thought it was carrying munitions. But everyone knew it totally wasn't, even though it actually was. But in 1916, before the mistakes really started rolling in for old Hindenburg and his wacky lads, there was something that flew under the radar. The Germans built trade submarines to send to the US, which was neutral at the time. This was a really good idea. As the US was neutral, it accepted German trade, but they managed to screw it up again. Germany was going through a famine at the time, the Turnip Winter, which sounds like a failed Oscar bait movie, and they desperately needed food. The U-boats got through the British naval blockade to the US, got back, did it again, and then they had to stop because the US had joined the fucking war. Way to go, guys! The straw that broke the Eagle's back, however, was the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, pissing off Woodrow Wilson enough to go back on his word and ask Congress for war, which was a one-time thing and no president ever lied to the U.S. public ever again.
Well, I'm not a crook.
Ever again.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
Ever again.
We have no ambition in Iraq.
Ever again.
Nobody is listening to your telephone calls.
Ever again, it. Besides direct action, there were other small tactical decisions that contributed, but those were the main issues. The other thing is that the US had a massive German population at the time. And it's not like today where most people are like, I'm 25% Polish, 13% German, 3% Scottish, 0.7%. Shut the fuck up, Greg. We're both whiter than goddamn sour cream and you know it. No, these were actual German as my first language, I still have bratwurst in my teeth immigrants. Hell, there were around 500 German language newspapers active in the US at the time. It's not like the Kaiser had an uphill fucking battle or anything. All he had to do was not poke the giant monster country who had just kicked Spain and Mexico's ass and was capable of mass production on a scale that would have made him shit his aristocratic pants. And these immigrants weren't people who left their history behind. There was actual fighting in cities like Chicago between immigrants of countries involved in the war. Keeping the US neutral should have been a walk in the trench. Oh, forget. But no, they had to go and kill American civilians and put to bed any chance they had for an ending that didn't result in their defeat or humiliation, leading to the rise of a genocidal maniac disguising himself as a patriot, hell-bent on the destruction of entire races, all so he could have Russia for his castles and mech suits. So here we go. Oh, and before I get started, I recognize that I'm assuming that all of my changes go exactly according to plan for Germany. I'm well f***ing aware of that. Murphy's Law is a thing that's more true than most people care to admit, especially when trying to headbutt a machine gun. But if we don't assume that, then there's no point in this channel. Okay, so I don't blame you if you leave after that one. But let's start in 1915, where Germany was making life in the Royal Merchant Navy somehow worse for early 20th century sailors. Although they did force rationing among the British population, U-boats were never going to be as effective as they needed to be. Hell, in 1916, Britain started the naval convoy system that pretty much neutralized the entire U-boat effort. I'm aware that U-boats were briefly very successful just after Germany took off the gloves for the second time, but that was only because the British Admiralty didn't want to offer protection, which is pretty dumb, you guys. But then again, the saying is, if at first you don't succeed, sacrifice tens of thousands of more lives to try again. But they never would have stopped if Germany hadn't, so the point is kind of moot. Instead, maybe Germany could have, I don't know, found a way to feed its starving citizens and soldiers with the U-boats. My first two changes would be to stop unrestricted submarine warfare and immediately repurpose most of the U-boats for trade. Remember, Germany isn't exactly the richest in natural resources. I'm fairly certain its two main exports at the time were Jägermeister and fucking glorious mustaches. So using one of the few successful ways they had to get through Churchill and his glorious but probably shit-faced navy makes a lot of sense. They should be doing that instead of pointlessly sinking ships like you're maliciously attacking a Tumblr fandom. And also, while I'm at it, I'm also going to make the rest of the Imperial German Navy do something. Anything! They sat there the whole damn war after the Battle of Jutland and didn't give the Royal Navy any real trouble. Seriously, the Kaiser was in a full-on build-off with His Majesty in the lead-up to the war. And then the ships just fucking sat there after one wonky battle. Yes, there were small clashes, and being real, they wouldn't have done too much against that fucking wall of ships that Britain had deployed. But they at least could have scored a victory here and there and kept them somewhat occupied. Seriously, anything but just fucking sitting there the whole time! Join the party, boys! Shiver me fucking Spetzel! I know that the submarines and the Navy were pretty much the basis of my whole Germany comes out on top argument in the beginning, but for the none of you that stuck around after trying your best to make me feel sad in the comments, there are a couple more things that I would want to change to boost my chances of beating the country that my mother is from and consider a second home, and a country that went to war in bright red and blue uniforms. First of all, and I know that they kind of did this already, and it goes without saying, but Germany needed to deploy as many forces as it could to Russia as soon as the war started. I know the Eastern Front, Brusilov offensive aside, was already Russia just charging into artillery shells like anything was going to change after the first try. But the sooner you kick them in the shins and force them to tap out, the better. You clearly aren't breaking through the Western Front, and the French nearly drove their own army to collapse trying to move the Germans out of the trenches they dug in the first 3 months of the war, especially when the Hindenburg Line turned a big chunk of the German front into a rubber band of death. So scrap Verdun, scrap Ypres or Flanders or whatever the hell it's called, and focus on keeping Dum and Detter from breaking through your front. The other thing to worry about was the invention of the tank, which was gonna happen no matter what. Churchill wanted something that could cross the trenches, and Britain came through for him with the weapon that we all know and love to hate for other people spawning into before us on conquest mode. This was eventually going to force the Germans to adapt, especially with how many the British ended up producing and fielding. So this would require the Germans to force a French defeat, or at the very least an armistice or peace treaty, before they could be widely deployed, which was summer of 18. But remember, these tanks weren't very reliable and could be knocked out pretty easily by artillery or captured right up until the war ended. So a more focused effort or strategy to stop them could have been developed. With no US, the German and Austrian army can force Russia out either as early as they did or earlier, keep letting Italy charge across the Isonzo and into hell, and have enough manpower and food to make their punch through the Entente lines in 1918 much more powerful. If they manage to reach Amiens, the whole Entente are officially up creek with no paddles. As to who would win in the real world, with a universe that kicks you in the dick every time it has the chance, this is a lot harder to predict, as there are a lot of factors at play even with the changes I made. Sure, Germany isn't starving, but Britain no longer has to defend against U-boats. But with the Kaiser doing everything short of wearing a cowboy hat and going hunting with Big Bad Ted to try to keep the Americans neutral, I think it's feasible that Germany could have at the very least had a much more favorable peace negotiation than the Treaty of Versailles, which was the real-life version of a public guillotining. Sure, this irrevocably changes the future of everything, but that's not what I'm here for. Just go ask Cody to explain the rest. Thanks for watching. Be sure to do something, I guess. Go outside maybe? You've killed enough time on here to have gotten to your lunch break by now, right?